Welcome back to Murder of Facts.
Professor Nicholas Wood is a general paediatrician, senior staff specialist and associate director, clinical research and services at the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. He heads the clinical research AusVac safety and paediatric active enhanced disease surveillance programs. Nick's a professor in the discipline of child and adolescent health at the University of Sydney. He leads New South Wales Immunisation Specialist Services. He's a senior investigator on the Primary Health Network Immunisation Support Program. Nick's interest is in maternal and neonatal immunisation, as well as research into vaccine safety, including genetics and long-term outcomes of adverse events following immunisation. Nick, thanks for joining me.
Great to be here.
Vaccines are important to Australia's health. How important are they? How do we use them to manage all of our community's health?
Yeah, so vaccines are really important at an individual person level and also at a community level. So at the individual level, the whole idea behind giving a kid or a person a vaccine is that they'll make immunity to the vaccine so that when they come across or potentially come across that virus or bacteria in the wild, their body says, I've already seen this before because I've had the vaccine, and therefore there's immunity on board, and that means that the person doesn't get sick, end up in hospital, and in worst cases die. So because they've had the vaccine, so they provide protection to the individual person. So that's really important. So it's a little bit like wearing a seatbelt. The purpose of the seatbelt is to stop you getting injured if you're in a car accident. At a community level, though, what we can do is if we get enough people vaccinated, so more than 90%, what will that allow us to do is actually to remove certain diseases from the world altogether. And a great example of that is the smallpox eradication. So we got enough people vaccinated, which meant smallpox couldn't transmit from person to person anymore. And so we got rid of it. And we can potentially do that with things like measles. And so at an individual level, it's a great way to protect yourself, but it also has community benefits.
Vaccines are really complex, and before they come into Australia, it's a long history before they get here. Take us through that. The first part is development of the vaccine. What's involved in that?
Yeah, so the first thing we do is we look at the bacteria or the virus, and then scientists will work out which part of that bacterial virus, when you get infected, does your body respond to? What sort of immune response does it make? And once they've identified that, they can then sort of isolate or take that bit of the virus or bacteria and try and make a vaccine. And the first thing they do is they will test that in the animals. So we might use mice or in some cases guinea pigs. And what they're doing is they're giving the mice or the guinea pig the test dose of the vaccine, and then they're able to measure the safety by looking at how the animal responds, but then also look at the immune response. So these are what's known as preclinical trials or preclinical studies. That means studies that happen before we actually start giving it to humans. And it's only those products or those vaccines that are found to be safe in the animal world that make it anywhere near a human. And so once they've done that, and that can take many years, they then are able to start the trials in humans. And first thing we do is we start with healthy adults. And these are small trials, might only be 10 or 20 adults. And the goal there is to look at the safety of the vaccine. So they'll give different doses. They might start with a very low dose and then, see the immune response. And if that's working, they might say that's the dose we need. If it's not high enough, doesn't give such a good immune response, then they might increase the amount. And so once they've done those what we call phase 1 trials, which are the sort of trials to test the safety of the vaccine, they do also look at the immune response. They then move into different larger studies, and that's called phase 2, and then ultimately a phase 3 trial. And the phase 3 trials are much, much bigger trials, and they're in the order of sometimes 20 to 30,000 people in those studies. And the goal there is to look at the immune response, but also monitoring safety, but then also to look whether the vaccine is effective. And so because you've got such a large number of people, they can then monitor those people and over time, 6 months, 12 months, to see if they get the disease or not. So that's the sort of logical progression that happens for when a vaccine is being initially thought of, and how it gets to the eventual point when the company says, we've got enough safety and effectiveness data to take this for potential licensure.
And so that's not the end of the development. Once it's been through research and development, animal trials, several stages of human trials, then it still has to be registered in Australia. Tell us about that registration process.
Yeah, so what tends to happen, and in fact what happens in all occasions for vaccines to be sort of licensed, if you like, or registered, is that the company that is making that vaccine will provide to the regulatory authority, and the example you mentioned was the Therapeutic Goods Administration. There's a one in the US which people might have heard of before, called the FDA. And then there's a similar one in Europe called the EMEA. So they're the licensing authorities, and they're the ones that approve whether the vaccine, and they do this with medicines as well. So it's not just vaccines. The same thing happens with drugs, new antibiotics, etc. They'll be provided by the company what we call a clinical dossier or a file, and within that thousands of pages of documents, we'll have all of the preclinical, so the animal results. It'll also have the results of all of the human trials that have been done, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. They'll have detailed safety data. In some cases, the pharmaceutical companies may do trials in specific risk groups, so people that have, say, diabetes or heart disease, so they'll have all of those trial results as well. So all of that information is given to the regulator, the TGA or the FDA, and then it's independently reviewed. So they have the medical officers within the TGA or FDA look at all that information. They also go to an advisory committee of the TGA, which is called the Advisory Committee on Vaccines, which is, again, an independent group that will look over all of those documents and provide some advice to the TGA. And once the TGA is happy that the product is both safe and effective, then they'll decide what to register it for. And that when I say that, they'll say this vaccine or this medicine is registered for this use in this age group. And a good example of that is the flu vaccine, which we use every year. It's registered for the use to prevent against influenza infection in people aged 6 months and over. That sort of idea. So that's the registration process. Then once it's registered by the TGA, then separate groups will provide additional advice on how to use that vaccine. And when I say separate groups, people may have heard of ATAGI, because the name ATAGI became quite common during the COVID pandemic. So ATAGI is a group that provides technical advice to the government on how best to use that vaccine. So the first stage is the registration. If the regulator, like the TGA, feels there's not enough information in the file, that they don't feel confident that the safety and the efficacy is demonstrated, they'll go back to the pharmaceutical company and say, you're missing this data, please provide this, or we think you need to do some extra studies to provide the gaps in knowledge. So that's it's a bit of a to and fro process, and it can take many, many months. People may have been sort of worried that the whole process during the COVID pandemic was the shortcuts were taken. And I think it's important to tell folk that that's not the case. That shortcuts weren't taken. The same process was followed. The regulator was given all the information. It's just that the speed of the trials was faster because people were more willing to volunteer to go into the studies. So you can imagine with a large study with 20,000 people wanting to be enrolled, that could take many years to do. But because people were worried about COVID, they could enroll many people onto the studies much faster. And they had more money that was given, and they can open many more trial sites. So the whole process was still followed. It's just that we were able to do it in a faster way.
Larger trials, Nick?
Yeah, larger trials, because there was interest from the public to say, look, this is a real threat. Vaccines are a way to potentially protect us. And they opened up, in the US over 100 trial sites across the US, and each of those trial sites could enroll sort of, 50 to 100 people, and then you can enroll large numbers much more quickly. And also they had the money behind it as well. So I should say, when we do the bigger trials, and this leads on to the monitoring of the safety and the effectiveness, it doesn't stop once the drug's been registered. So you can imagine a trial with 20 to 40,000 people in it is able to detect fairly common side effects, but some of the rarer side effects it may not be able to pick up. And so that's why we have a really strong safety monitoring system in Australia and also in other countries to continue to monitor once the vaccine starts to be used in the community to ensure that we're not missing any safety problem.
Yeah. And Nick, you're head of clinical research, OSVAC safety. Tell us about how Australia monitors vaccines in order to pick up issues well ahead of schedule.
Yeah, so when they do the large trials, as I mentioned, we'll be able to hear some of the common side effects. And then once the vaccine gets rolled out into the community where we start to give it to many more people, the safety is monitored in a couple of ways. The first way is what we call our spontaneous reporting system, and that relies on people and clinicians, doctors, nurses, pharmacists, etc., who have the ability to, if they think they've experienced a side effect or a reaction to the vaccine, they can fill out a form and report that to the regulator, to the TGA. So this is happening. It's called the spontaneous system, and it's been happening for decades. And the TGA looks at all the reports coming in, and they put it into a database which you can actually look at publicly if you want to. And they're looking at the data, they're monitoring it, they're saying, is there an increased number of this particular side effect compared to previous months, etc. They're able to look at the how common they are, really. And so that's the one system, and that's a very common system used in Australia. It's also used in America. It's also used in Europe and in many other countries. And that actually, in fact, all of their data from those systems, the spontaneous systems, actually all gets fed into a much larger database, which is monitored in Uppsala. And so there's a global monitoring, if you like, as well. So it's not just sort of, here's the vaccine, start giving it, let's forget about it. We actually have the ability to keep watching. So that's the passive or spontaneous system. And that relies on people saying, well, perhaps this was a reaction, I'll report it. And that's important. We encourage that, because if some person reports it and then someone else reports it and then all of a sudden we get a few more reports, then what we can do is investigate that. And so the TGA will go and look in more detail to see, is this a real safety concern? So that's really important. So it's important for the public to know that's happening. The other thing we do is a system which is an active system. And what this relies on is people who've got the vaccine. What we do is we send them an electronic survey, either via SMS text or by an email, and we ask them a few days after the vaccine to let us know if they've had any side effects. And that's called the active system, and the name of that is OSVAC safety. So there are two systems: this passive spontaneous and this active one, and that's sort of a way to get at, well, this is relying on people spontaneously reporting, but it's also us going out to people saying, well, let's ask you, have you had any reactions?
Right.
And we gather data that way. And both these systems talk to each other regularly. There's also another system which is in the background, which is a data linkage system. So there are clinicians who are linking vaccine records with potential hospitalisations and GP presentations, and that's happening in the background, also looking for safety concerns. And an example of that, which people may have heard about in America, in the US, is called the Vaccine Safety Data Linkage System. We have some that data linkage happening in Australia, particularly in Western Australia and Victoria at the moment.
It's a long process going from concept through to community health. In Australia, are we good at monitoring vaccines, do you think?
Yeah, so we were able to pick up a safety signal almost 15 years ago now, which was a flu vaccine, where some of the flu vaccines were causing some high fevers in children. And that was picked up by our system. It led to the vaccine sort of being stopped or paused for that particular flu season. And then some investigations were done and was worked out why that vaccine was causing the flu story. So that was 15 years ago, and in that last 15 years, these systems have been in place, continuing to monitor the safety. And so I'm very confident that we're able to pick up any real safety concerns. Important right now with some flu around, that people not worried that there is a safety concern with this 2025 flu vaccine. We've been monitoring it in the passive system, but also in the active system, and we haven't found any significant issues. So, and that's the same as last year and the year before. So there's I think a really robust, strong systems in place to detect any. We don't want to be missing these sorts of issues, because it's the thing about vaccines is you're giving it to the community, to a person, to stop them getting a disease. So it's not like giving them a medicine when they're sick. Does that make sense? The person may never really get the disease, but we want to have them protected in case they get the disease, because you don't know, if I coughed flu virus on you, whether you'll get a bit of a runny nose and a cough and that's it, or you'll end up with pneumonia in hospital. So you just don't know. So you're better off having the vaccine on board, that will then protect you yourself from getting nasty flu and ending up with pneumonia. But it'll also, hopefully stop you getting flu and start passing it on to someone else.
Yeah, and perhaps someone vulnerable.
That's exactly right. Someone that's either pregnant or got cancer, or an elderly person with chronic medical conditions. Yeah, the more the frail elderly folk.
Yeah. Do you think we've come very far since the COVID outbreak in 2019? Do you think we've come very far in our understanding of vaccines and how they are developed and the function that they play in keeping communities safe?
Yeah, I think COVID showed us, like I said before, it showed us what we could do with the speed of developing a vaccine. What it did bring into play for the first time really since 2020 was a new technology, the mRNA vaccines. So we hadn't been using them prior to that. And that's opened up a whole new world of potential vaccines that use this technology to protect against other diseases. So that will be, something to watch. I think we've continued to monitor the safety of the vaccines very strongly with those two systems. So for people listening, the vaccines that we used in the infants, the 6-week, 4-month, 6-month-old vaccines, they really haven't changed in the last decade. So we're still using the same vaccines that we've been using for 10 years. And we've given that to millions of children. And we haven't seen any real issues with the safety. What we probably are experiencing now is a little bit of a vaccine hesitancy. And whether that's because people got sick of us or people talking about vaccines with COVID, and that is a bit of a worry to us in public health land and in clinicians seeing patients, because we don't want to see vaccine uptake fall such that we start to see diseases that we know we can prevent, if that makes sense. I don't want to see a baby coming in with whooping cough when I know that that baby could have been prevented from getting that. I don't really want to see kids with measles.
Yeah.
Measles is, can be as simple as a bit of a fever and a rash to pneumonia and brain damage. And again, like I said before, you can't know if you get infected how bad it's going to be, but we know predictably what you'll get from the vaccine, and we also know that they work. So I think we are at this point now where there's a little bit of a downslide in some of the vaccine uptake, and we need to turn that around so that we don't continuing to see it slide back.
I know that with vaccine uptake at the moment, access is also an issue. We all live very, very, very busy lives. But of course, there are lots of places you can be vaccinated, and getting access to the communities where it's needed is something that's always going to be a challenge, but something I know Australia is working towards.
Yeah, so we've got one good thing is we've got and I think COVID helped us do this as well. We've seen a real increase in the ability for pharmacies to give vaccines. So they would become an important workhorse during the rollout of the COVID vaccines, workhorse and a workforce. And so, pharmacies are good because you may not necessarily need to make an appointment, and there are probably many more of them around. GPs are important, community health, council clinics are also important. Aboriginal medical services are doing it. So there's now a range of places you can get vaccines. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much and great to talk.
Thanks for joining us on Matter of Facts. You can get all of the Matter of Facts podcasts on ifa.org.au. Thanks for joining us.